So welcome, and I thank Leon very much. It really is always an honor to work at a college in which someone like Leon runs the ship and meets our respect in openness to new ideas and simply also intellectual curiosity and brilliance. So it's always a pleasure to be here and work with him. And I welcome you all to our conference, Thinking in Dark Times, the Crises of Democracy. My 7-year-old son asked me recently what would happen in a nuclear war. This no longer seems surprising. We have a president so boorish, mean, and impulsive that he is called a moron by his own Secretary of State. President Trump lies so obviously that his constant prevarications have torn asunder our common reality. His tweets and insults assault our sanity on a daily basis. They get into our mind. The president is unwilling to unambiguously denounce fascists, anti-Semites, and racists. His abuse of women is notorious. The Republican chairman of the Senate's Committee on Foreign Relations says that the president is like a petulant child endangering the world. Major publications are publishing primers on the 25th Amendment's procedure for removing an incompetent president. It is important, I think, to say that we are not currently living through totalitarianism or fascism. President Trump has not mobilized terror, concentration camps, arbitrary arrests, a secret police, or a party apparatus that rises above the state. He is not a tyrant or a despot. For decades, many of us living in the Western liberal representative democracies had thought such worries relics of a past age. We were, we now know, naive to believe in the stability of modern representative democracies. We looked away as skyscrapers built by migrant laborers sprouted for a cosmopolitan elites in Dubai. We turned a blind eye to resentment against illegal immigration and applauded as the European Union created a new constitution without a vote. All the while, we ignored how the working classes around the world were hollowed out, squeezed, disenfranchised, and abandoned. Financial markets soared. CEOs paid themselves 370 times the salary of their average workers, and global cities became our playgrounds. And while this was happening, we elected Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, three of the least politically experienced and most polarizing presidents in our nation's history. Our confidence in the stability of representative democracy now seems like a dangerous nostalgia for a golden age of security that lasted from the 1950s through the first decades of the 21st century. It seems that our faith in representative democracy during the last 50 years could go on only because nobody cared. In retrospect, it may be possible to mark the beginning of our democratic crisis. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy gave the commencement address at Yale University. The president told the graduates that they were entering a very different world. Past graduates had found themselves in a world beset by great questions, Kennedy said. When John C. Calhoun graduated in 1804, the nation was divided over the questions of a national bank and slavery. When William Howard Taft graduated in 1878, the nation was grappling with questions of Reconstruction and the progressive movement. In the 1930s, at the end of Taft's career, the United States was again buffeted by forces of political and economic division surrounding economic liberalism and the New Deal. For nearly 200 years, Kennedy said, politics in the United States had been riven by dramatic disagreements on which the nation was sharply divided and emotionally divided. Such ideological political divisions, however, Kennedy said, were specters of a different past. And so he announced, well, it's not going to come up, but I'll read it to you. Today, Kennedy said, today these old sweeping issues very largely have disappeared The central domestic issues of our time relate not to basic clashes of philosophy or ideology, but to ways and means of reaching common goals, to research for sophisticated solutions to complex and obstinate issues. In a sense, Kennedy said, politics is dead. We no longer have political and ideological disagreements. What we need are competent technocratic solutions. This was in 1962. This was possibly the worst timed speech in political history. Kennedy's confidence that major political questions were behind us ran into the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the 60s counterculture, the Civil Rights Revolution. The 1980s then brought the Reagan Revolution. The 21st century saw the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, and then there's Donald Trump. In spite of being completely wrong, Kennedy's technocratic faith, his belief that the kinds of problems we face today are those for, quote, which technical answers, not political answers, must be provided, sounds eerily familiar. His belief that expert analysis should and would replace political contestation is today bipartisan boilerplate. Tony Blair offered a new free market labor party. Emmanuel Macron, a former investment banker and founder of the centrist En Marche, and Angela Merkel of the conservative Christian Democrats are beloved by educated elites because they elevate competence over ideology. Bill and Hillary Clinton built the former's presidency and the latter's campaign on the promise of a third way that melded blue dog democratic centrism with technocratic competence. George W. Bush, in the midst of a war, depoliticized major decisions in Iraq by saying that our, quote, our commanders on the ground will determine the size of troop levels. And President Barack Obama was deeply deferential to the experience of conventional authorities, the expertise of conventional authorities, whether they be generals, national security professionals, political operatives like Rahm Emanuel, and mainstream economists and bankers like Larry Summers and Tim Geithner. Jedediah Purdy writes that President Obama personifies the technocratic style of our anti-political times. It is my thesis today that our crisis of democracy is deeply entwined with the rise of this technocratic and anti-political approach to politics. In a recent column, David Brooks sought to defend politics against what he called the anti-politics of populism. Brooks argued that politics is about the engagements among plural people who have different opinions in a common public sphere. Well, here you get Kennedy, and here you get Brooks. He writes, quote, politics is an activity in which you recognize the simultaneous existence of different groups, interests, and opinions. The downside of politics is that people never really get everything they want. It's messy, limited, and no issue is ever really settled. But that's sort of the beauty of politics, too. It involves an endless conversation in which we learn about other people and see things from their vantage point and try to balance their needs against our own. Plus, it's better than the alternative, ruled by some authoritarian tyrant who tries to govern by clobbering everyone in his way. Brooks' defense of the messiness of politics, of a pluralist politics, gets something deeply right. Politics is based, as Hannah Arendt wrote, upon the fact of plurality. Politics is the centripetal force, a magnetic or charismatic center, a pole, which is where the word polis comes from. Politics is a pole, the center, around which a diverse and chaotic multitude gathers and is held together. And the politician is that person who speaks or acts in such a way as to enable the people to say what they share in common in spite of their differences. But even as he praises this messiness of politics, Brooks recoils from the tumultuous nature of populist politics. The problem with populists, he writes, is that they refuse to recognize expertise. They don't like the social scientists and the technocrats that Brooks believes are most qualified to govern our democracy. Brooks dislikes the Tea Party and also the Bernie Sanders contingent of the left for the same reasons. They want to elect people who are immature political actors, people who, quote, don't recognize restraints. The populists Brooks means are political precisely in the way that Kennedy thought was a thing of the past. They are pugilistic rather than technocratic. They have ideologies that they want total victories for themselves, and they are not inclined to listen to experts. Brooks is right that populism can be crude, coarse, and dangerous. We're experiencing that right now. Right and also left-wing populisms threaten the stability of a liberal democratic consensus around technocratic governance of stable liberal representative democracies. With the rise of populist politics in the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Hungary, as President Botstein just mentioned, traditional liberal democracies are experiencing a crisis. The weakening of that democratic consensus is scary. This is especially so because it is the weakness of Western democracies in the 1930s that led to the rise of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes across Europe. Driven by real fears, it is only natural to ask and to seek to defend our institutions and the norms of liberal representative democracies. We should and must do so. But so much reflection on democratic crises today assumes only such a defensive posture, the posture of protecting our crisis-riddled democracies. But such a defensive posture defends democracies that are in crisis. It is my hope that we can take advantage of this crisis to make democracy stronger. A crisis, writes Hannah Arendt, tears away facades and obliterates prejudices. She writes, and this is from the Crisis in Education, the opportunity provided by the very fact of crisis, which tears away facades and obliterates prejudices, is to explore and inquire into whatever has been laid bare of the essence of the matter. A crisis forces us back to the questions themselves and requires from us either new or old answers, but in any case, direct judgments. A crisis becomes a disaster only when we respond to it with preformed judgments, that is, with prejudices. Populist and authoritarian movements have exposed the fantasy of peaceful, stable, liberal representative democracies. The forgotten middle class has risen up and said enough. Black Americans subject to police violence are insisting that Black lives matter. Around the world, millions of citizens of these democratic regimes are rebelling. They are raising fundamental questions about previously taken for granted assumptions concerning political inclusion and exclusion, ethnic and racial prejudice, and economic and social inequality. If Arendt is right and a crisis only becomes a disaster when we respond to it with prejudices, we need to look upon our prejudices with open eyes. In what follows, I want to suggest 4 prejudices that have been exposed by our democratic crisis. 4 prejudices that we must obliterate, or at the very least, we must open ourselves to revisiting these prejudices. First, and I don't want to say we have to obliterate all the prejudices, but we have to obliterate them as prejudices. We have to engage in a conversation and direct judgment about them. First prejudice, populist movements have revealed the prejudice widely held by many in this room that democracy is by its very nature liberal. By liberal, I don't mean left-wing or progressive. The liberal tradition has its source in the freedom from oppression, whether it be the oppression of tyrants, aristocrats, oligarchs, or the democratic majority. Liberalism speaks the language of civil and human rights. The nobility of the liberal tradition is that it recognizes that human beings and political citizens possess certain natural and political rights that are crucial for human dignity. Against the liberal tradition of plurality and individual rights, the democratic tradition has its foundation in the power and equality of the people. As Alexis de Tocqueville understood, democracy is about the equality of conditions. No one has the traditional, political, or God-given rights to rule over me, not even experts. What is too often overlooked is that the liberal and democratic traditions are generally opposed to each other. Liberalism opposes and suppresses the coarser elements of democratic freedom. So as Tocqueville writes in Democracy in America, a very civilized society tolerates only with great difficulty the trials of freedom in a township democracy. The civilized community is disgusted at the township's numerous blunders and is apt to despair of success before the experiment is completed. Tocqueville saw that the spirit of the United States democracy in townships was governed by non-experts, farmers, teachers, and shop owners. These were the coarser elements who resist educated opinion, which is why township freedom is usually sacrificed to enlightened government. A government by elites and experts risks actively disempowering the people. When liberalism triumphs over democracy, the people no longer feel they have a meaningful opportunity for participation concerning important decisions. This is the public sphere Leon was talking about. The very idea of democracy as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people is too often opposed by elites in the name of pluralism and civilization, which foreclose democratic possibilities and alternative ways of free peoples choosing to live in their own way. Once we understand the contradiction between liberalism and democracy, we can understand how the victory of the liberal idea of democracy carries with it a democratic deficit. A democratic deficit that can contribute to right-wing and also left-wing anti-establishment parties. A second prejudice exposed by our crises of democracy is that modern representative democracy should be individualist and is endangered by collectivist nationalism. Politics, Arendt reminds us, is the gathering of a group of diverse persons around certain common experiences and shared belief, around a common world. Insofar as political elites, especially those associated with the social democratic left, but I think much more broad than that as well, have defined politics as the pursuit of individual interests, they either ignore or reject the political need to mobilize passions and create collective forms of identification. Elite and technocratic democratic politicians recoil from arguments about rootedness, belonging, and fundamental questions about how to organize our common world and shared existence. Technocratic democracy forgets that politics must not only feed the people bread, but also inspire and give them meaning. It is this rootedness and homelessness of modern life that Hannah Arendt argues leaves the people susceptible to totalitarian movements that satisfy their deep human need for belonging. A third prejudice made evident by our democratic crises is that we see our political antagonists as evil. Instead of understanding political opponents as people with different opinions and different interests, the moralists of the anti-political elite imagines the populists as violent outsiders who threaten the post-political consensus. This is true on the left and the right. So confident in their access to the truth, elites refuse to engage in debate with those who disagree and instead present them as a moral enemy to be destroyed and eradicated. They are the deplorables. When our opponents are evil, no common democratic world is possible. On all sides, we can retreat into our comfortable bubbles of affirmation. We live content in the echo chambers of our superiority. We recoil from the hard work of democracy, of listening and learning to find those commonalities amidst our differences. The prejudice against politics is governed by a profound fear. Taken together, these three prejudices, that democracy is liberal, that democracy is individualist, and that democracy moralizes our opponents as evil and undeserving of sharing a liberal democracy, reveal a fourth and overriding prejudice underlying our democratic crisis. Democracy today is prejudiced against politics. It is prejudiced against politics by its preference for security over freedom. The prejudice against politics is governed by a profound fear, the fear that humanity could destroy itself through politics and through the means of force now at its disposal. Having lived through totalitarianism and having witnessed the dropping of nuclear bombs, we today are deeply aware that politics may well destroy the political, economic worlds we have built. It may even destroy the earth. From out of this fear of politics, Hannah Arendt writes, there comes what she considers to be an even more dangerous and horrible hope. She writes, "Underlying our prejudice against politics today are hope and fear. The fear that humanity could destroy itself through politics and through the means of force now at its disposal, and linked with this fear, the hope that humanity will come to its senses and rid the world, not of humankind, but of politics. It could do so through a world government that transforms the state into an administrative machine, resolves political conflicts bureaucratically, and replaces armies with police forces. Terrified by the danger of politics in an age of horrifying technical power, it is all too likely that democracies will seek to replace politics with technocratic and bureaucratic administration. But such a hope, Arendt argues, will more likely lead to what she calls a despotism of massive proportions, in which the abyss separating the rulers from the world would be so gigantic that any sort of rebellion would no longer be possible. We will, in other words, trade our political and democratic freedom for the security of expert rule." Hannah Arendt knew that democratic freedom is tenuous, and this is the quote that I've chosen to represent the conference for the year. She writes, "Representative government is in crisis today, partly because it has lost, in the course of time, all institutions that permitted the citizens' actual participation, and partly because it is now gravely affected by the disease from which the party system suffers, bureaucratization and the two parties' tendency to represent nobody except the party machines." Arendt saw the weakness of representative democracy to be its basic idea, that citizens should turn over the time-consuming work of government to professional politicians. This fundamental anti-political prejudice of representative democracy is magnified in an age where technology brings terror of massive political destruction. And so, we prefer a government of experts, not least because it frees us to spend time on our own private pursuits, like luxuries, families, and our private lives. The disempowerment of the people in a representative democracy embraces our bourgeois preference to be freed to pursue our individual interests, to be relieved of the duty of politics and public virtue. It is much easier to leave the governing to the experts. That, I believe, is, in many ways, those are the prejudices that we need to reopen and interrogate if we are going to, in a sense, grow from and learn from our crisis of democracy, instead of suffering from it and having it become truly dangerous. I know many people think it's already become dangerous, and in many times it could and has, but it will become more so if we don't, in some way, take this crisis and learn from it. And that is why we're having this conference. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from philosophers and artists, politicians and activists. Our speakers include leftist revolutionaries and members of the far right. What unites our speakers is that they have, in their writing, showed the kind of bold and fearless pursuit of insight that makes Hannah Arendt's writing so potent and exciting. Today, right after me, you'll hear from a Russian journalist who has insightfully explored the ways Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, two politicians who have excelled at exploiting liberal democracies by replacing idealism and unapologetic greed and cruelty in the striving for power. You'll hear from a Southern journalist who asks how the American South can fit into a 21st century American democracy. We'll have a conversation between a reformed political activist turned small-town politician and a small-town girl turned national politician. Martin Gurry spent years working with the Director of National Intelligence. His book, The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium, argues that technology has made it impossible for elites to control public narratives. Gurry asks whether we are fated to live in a post-truth age in which all authority is illegitimate. Melvin Rogers and Yascha Mounk are political theorists who become public intellectuals. Rogers worries that the extent to which a pluralist democracy can remain inclusive so that minority populations do not feel permanently alienated from democracy, how that works and whether that can happen. Munk, working from data from the World Values Survey, suggests that for many citizens, and especially for many millennials, democracy is no longer a priority. Too many, he argues, are willing to trade democratic freedom for political and economic security. And later this afternoon, you'll hear from two artists, Tanya Bruguera and Galit Alat, who make artistic experiences designed to engage people in acts of citizenship, both of whom are inspired by Hannah Arendt. Finally, there's a number of breakout sessions during the day when you and speakers can continue the discussion about how to think about the crises of democracy in these dark times. I hope you have a fantastic 2 days. Let me now welcome to the podium my colleague Marina Venezuelan, who will introduce our first speaker. Thank you very much.